Bearing God's name. Why Sinai still matters. This is part one of a series where we will be looking at thoughts from this book, Bearing God's Name, Why Sinai Still Matters, by Carmen Joy Imes. The book is a presentation of Professor Imes' doctoral thesis that is also easy to read for lay people. As there is unfortunately no German translation, I created a German translation of parts of it, and we will at least deal with excerpts from her presentation. For English readers, I encourage you to read the book completely, and you will enjoy it. But why is this of any interest to us today? In the foreword to her book, Imes describes the usual reservations very well. The Old Testament has been given a bad rap for lots of reasons. Too violent, too confusing, too remote, too legalistic, too outdated. What many lack in the Old Testament is the grace that seems so essential in the New Testament. We will see that this is not the case at all, and that Christians in particular need the Old Testament more than ever, and especially the Mosaic Law. Excuse me? The Mosaic Law of all things? We will also see that the text from Exodus 27, "You shall not make wrongful use of the name of the Lord your God," in RSV, what it actually means. The significance of the actual meaning is still the same today as it was then, as can be seen from the first words of the foreword by Christopher J.H. Wright. And he wrote in the foreword, "And you call yourself a Christian? That was about the worst thing we feared hearing as young Christians in my Northern Ireland childhood. Whatever it was, the most stinging rebuke from other kids, or worst of all from a teacher, would be, 'And you call yourself a Christian?' So being called a Christian, bearing the name of Christ, that was very important. So your behavior was related to it. And we will see that this is also the topic we will find in the first 5 books of the Bible. Therefore, we will not only look at Exodus 27, but at the Mosaic Law and the events at Sinai at the time. I know what you're maybe thinking. Oh, that's as dry as the desert at Sinai. But you'll be surprised. With a good guide through the events, it will be very interesting. Just imagine what the Israelites had experienced until they reached Sinai. What do you need to live when you are on your way through the desert, after all? And what does Moses get from God? The law with all its rules. But how does Moses see this? We can read it. And in Deuteronomy 4, verses 5 to 8, according to the 2001 translation, Moses says this: "Look, I've shown you all the rules and decisions, just as Yahweh gave them to me. So you must follow them in the land that you're traveling to and which you will inherit. Obey them and do them, because this is what will brand you as wise and understanding people to the nations. For when they hear all these rules, they'll say, 'Look, they're a great nation of wise and understanding people.' What other nation is there that's so great that they have a God as close to them as our God Yahweh is to us, and to whom we may call about anything? And what other nation has rules and decisions that are as righteous as all these laws that I'm setting before you today?" With other words, the Israelites have received something precious with the law that the other nations will be jealous of. Interesting. But we will not be so much concerned with the 10 commandments or the many individual regulations, but with the overall picture. We will recognize that the five of the Pentateuch, the 5 books of the Pentateuch, contain an interesting framework that we may never have consciously noticed when reading them, because we have only seen the details probably. We will talk about the actual purpose of the law and the task of the Israelites, and how this is taken up again in the New Testament. Because God has not abandoned his plan, but gives all people the opportunity to fulfill the original mission. So let's start with becoming the people who bear God's name. So we start at leaving Egypt, and the context is our focus now. Context is everything. And you may remember in my previous series, The New Perspective on Paul, which is based on the book The New Perspective on Paul, an introduction by Professor Kent L. Yinger. We have already seen that many Christians may have the following idea. First, in the Old Testament, Israel was concerned with earning salvation by keeping the Sinai covenant. Jesus did away with this idea and made salvation available without any personal action. In this series, however, we also, in the series about the New Perspective on Paul, we also saw that both statements are not really based on the Holy Scriptures, but more on reflections of later scholars and people in the Reformation. Carmen Imes also addresses this in her book and shows why the first statement cannot be true. The first statement that they try to earn their salvation by keeping the covenant. She writes, "Consider the context. Israel arrives at Sinai in Exodus 19 and receives the law from Yahweh. However, we find Israel's rescue from Egypt both chronologically and in the text earlier in Exodus 3 to 14. The law from Sinai cannot therefore have been the prerequisite for Israel's rescue from Egypt. Hence we also read this in Exodus 6:6. So go and tell the children of Israel that I am Jehovah or Yahweh, and that I will lead them out of the tyranny of the Egyptians and free them from slavery. I'll pay their ransom with a hard pitch and a great judgment." At Exodus 6:6, according to the 2001 translation. So God did not first check whether they perhaps still have idols at home, or whether they complied with the law in terms of morality. Their salvation had nothing to do with their righteousness or their actions, but with his promise to their forefather Abraham. And the following aspect of Exodus 12:13 is also interesting in this context. There we can read, "The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you live. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague will come upon you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt." Exodus 12:13, New American Standard Bible. It's interesting that the Hebrew word Pasach, from which our Passover is derived, can be translated to pass over. But in this context, however, another meaning makes more sense, and as can also be found in Isaiah 31, verse 5. So we could translate it this way, as it is translated in the 2001 translation. "Now this blood will be the sign that you are inside of each house. For when I see the blood, I'll protect you, and you won't be a part of the plague of destruction when I strike the land of Egypt. And that's what Carmen Imes also writes. In Exodus 12, 13, 23, and 27, Yahweh does not pass over Israel, but protects it. Very interesting point, and we will come to back later on. Let's come to Sinai, and we have these wilderness journeys, and we will see now that it is actually framing Sinai. In which sense? So the account of Israel in Sinai contains another special feature that we may never have noticed before. In Exodus 33, the entire itinerary of Israel's hike from Egypt to Canaan is described. There are 42 camping spots on the itinerary. However, if we read the accounts in Exodus 12 to 18 and Numbers 11 to 32 carefully, we only come across 6 campsites before and after Sinai. And they all begin with the same Hebrew phrase, and they set out. So we have found no contradiction in the books of Moses. Both accounts fulfill a different purpose. And the purpose of the accounts before and after Sinai is made clear in this illustration from Carmen Imes' book, where we have Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and the Sinai at the center. And there are desert travels, 6 ones, as we said, in Exodus before and 6 afterwards in Numbers, which is not the number we found in Exodus 33, but a symmetry before and after. And this is not a mere coincidence, but a common way of emphasizing something at that time and in that culture. And it becomes clear from the other symmetrical reports. For example, before Sinai and after Sinai in this table. Before, we have 6 campsites, as we said, and this phrase, and they set out in Exodus 12 to 18. After Sinai, we also have 6 campsites, and they set out in Numbers 11 to 32. Before Sinai, 7 times the desert is mentioned, and it's the same after Sinai. In Exodus 17, we see that God's provision of manna and quail, Exodus 16, as well as 2 requests for water satisfied by a gushing rock. And 1 story about manna and quail in Numbers 11, and 2 requests for water satisfied by a gushing rock in Numbers 20. So again, a symmetry. We have God's angelic messenger protects the Hebrews from a foreign king in Exodus 14. And we have the same thing in Numbers 22. We see that Israel fights the Amalekites in Exodus 17, and we have the same in Numbers 14. In Exodus 18, we see Moses meets with a Midianite family member and receives guidance. And we have exactly the same in Numbers 10. Before Sinai, Exodus 18, Moses is weighed down with leadership responsibilities. And we have the same thing in Numbers 11. And then in Exodus 18, we also see that Moses begins delegating responsibilities to others. And we have the same thing in Numbers 11. Moses begins delegating responsibilities to others. And deliberate quotation from Exodus can be found here. So it's even citing Exodus. Numbers uses words from Exodus. So there is a link in between. And Israel laments why they left Egypt in Exodus 14. The same situation is in Numbers 14, where Israel laments due to the report of the scouts. So slightly different topic, but same thing. And all these things are symmetric and are framing what happened at Sinai. So why are the events at Sinai so emphasized by this framework? Because a great transformation had taken place there. The Israelites were in a state of liminality, so-called liminality at Sinai, a phase of transition, a fundamental change in their status. They were no longer slaves of Egypt. But what would they become? What kind of God is Yahweh? What would he expect from them? Of them? What would their future look like? If in her book she describes it this way. For Israel, the wilderness journey from Egypt to Canaan is liminal space, far more than just a place to pass through. It is a workshop of Israel's becoming. And that's important. So far from just a place to pass through, it is the workshop of Israel's becoming. The wilderness is the temporary destination that makes them who they are. Liminal places always do this. They change us. And then she mentions, God is not in a hurry to lead them out of liminal space into the land he promised to give them. They are not ready yet. When we fully imagine the magnitude of the change, the unanswered questions, and the uncertainty about the future and the nature of God who had saved them, we also better understand why they were seemingly so quick to forget God's power to save them. Who wouldn't worry about water and food in the desert, surrounded by hostile peoples and nations? So she writes, Yahweh knows this. Remarkably, he does not chide the Israelites when they complain or panic as they travel toward Sinai. He simply provides for their needs. He utilizes this track to demonstrate to them his trustworthiness. And we find that in Exodus 13, verses 17 to 18, 21 and 22, where we can read, according to the 2001 translation, well, after Pharaoh had sent the people away, God didn't lead them towards the land of the Philistines, even though it wasn't far away, because God said, I'm doing this to keep the people from having a change of heart when they see war, and from thereafter returning to Egypt. So God led them around the desert towards the sea. God led them there using a tall column of clouds during the day to show them the way, and a tall column of fire during the night. The column of clouds was there all day long, every day, and the column of fire was always there in front of the people all night long. And I'm summarized that way. Trust is not automatic, and God does not expect it to be. He patiently works on Israel's behalf until they can see that he is worth of their confidence. He is worthy of their confidence. A remarkable sentence. And if we think about what we read in the Bible with this idea in mind, that we understand much more than before. So just the Israelites go to school, so to speak. That's a training for them. They learn that they must and can trust Yahweh, God, every day. That they depend on him daily. On the way to Sinai, the Israelites find out what kind of God Yahweh is and how they can live in trust in him. That was part 1 of this series, and thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you in part 2 then. Goodbye.